So every time there's a war or an eclipse or somebody stubs their toe, it seems like there is a resurgence in people being interested in eschatology. What is eschatology? Eschatology just means, in terms of theology, the study of the end times, the study of the last things. What is our doctrine of when we think the world is going to end? When do we think that Jesus is going to come back? And because of recent events, this happens pretty regularly, ironically. Some of my videos on eschatology are making their rounds again, and somebody very helpfully asked in my YouTube comment section recently that they would like to hear a breakdown of all of the eschatological positions. And I thought that would be really helpful because I am planning a video series on the applications of my personal eschatology. And I will reveal what that is later in the video. If you don't know already, if you're not a regular listener of the show, I think eschatology is really important. And it doesn't matter to a lot of people. Actually, I think it does matter, but people think it doesn't matter to them. And I think it does matter because where we think the world is going actually affects every single decision that we make today. If we think Jesus is going to come back tomorrow or next week or next month, that really heavily changes the way that we function day to day, I believe, as opposed to if we believe Jesus is coming back in 1,000 years. How we think the world is going to look soon totally changes the way that we act today. And if we think the world is going to look a certain way in 1,000 years, that also changes drastically how we act every day. And so eschatology, I think, is a lot more of an important doctrine than probably most average Christians think it is. A lot of average Christians probably haven't even heard the word eschatology and don't even know that there are multiple eschatological positions. I grew up pretty much thinking that what I believed was what everybody believed about eschatology, about when Jesus was going to come back. And then later, I realized that there are actually multiple positions. There are 3 main positions, and there are subcategories of each of those positions, and I'm going to break down each major position, and once we get to my position, I will tell you what my position is and some brief explanations as to why, although I will absolutely go into more detail about why, which one I believe is correct and why in the future. And I've also talked about many of the eschatological positions, specifically dispensational premillennialism, which might be how you found this video. And if you found this video and you're curious to learn more about dispensational premillennialism, which I have a number of videos on, which I actually disagree with, you can check out those videos as well. So, Christian eschatology, or the doctrine of the last things, has historically fallen into a few major categories, depending specifically on how somebody interprets Revelation 20, 1 through 6. Revelation 21 through 6 talks about something called the millennium, or the millennial reign of Christ, which is this idea that Christ is going to reign for 1,000 years. And there are different views on where we put that reign. Some views believe that that reign already happened. Some views believe that that is happening now. And some, well, really, the main Christian, the non-heretical Christian views, either have to believe that that reign is happening now or it is happening in the future. Because if Jesus already completed his reign and the resurrection already happened, that is a heretical view called full preterism, which means all of the biblical prophecies happened in the past. And so I'm not really going to cover that view because it's not taken seriously. All Christians believe that at least some of the prophecy in Revelation has already happened, and many Christians also believe, all Christians believe that at least some of the prophecies throughout Scripture have actually already been fulfilled. For example, the prophecies about Jesus Christ's birth, say Isaiah 53. So a lot of all Christians actually believe that Isaiah 53 refers to Jesus, and that prophecy of his birth is already fulfilled. Okay, so it is not unreasonable, in other words, to believe that at least some prophecy happens in the future, and it's also not unreasonable to believe that some prophecy has happened in the past. Which specific prophecies happen in the future or the past is really where the distinction between these eschatological views come in, which allows us to place where exactly is the millennial reign of Christ. Is Christ reigning now, or will Christ reign in the future? And it might be a weird question to ask, because most people, I think, would have the inclination to believe that, well, of course Christ isn't reigning now, because where is he? But there are actually some very good biblical reasons for why we ought to believe that Christ is reigning now. But I don't want to get ahead of myself. I will get to that later. So first, the three views are premillennialism, amillennialism, and postmillennialism. Premillennialism says that currently we are in the time pre the millennial reign of Christ, or we are in the time period prior to Christ's 1,000-year reign. Amillennialism is kind of a bad name because the prefix means no. So the name amillennialism would imply that amillennials believe in no millennium, except I don't think that's a very fair representation of amillennialism, because most amillennials believe that there are different kinds of amillennial views, but some believe that there is a reign, but either it's metaphorical or it is heavenly instead of earthly. But we'll get into that more later. And the third view is postmillennialism, that we are actually post the beginning of the millennial reign of Christ. The millennial reign of Christ is not over yet, but we are currently in the millennial reign of Christ, which could have some overlap with amillennialism, depending on the amillennial and depending on the postmillennial. So let's get into the views. First, premillennialism. Premillennialism, again, believes that we are pre the millennial reign of Christ, and that means Christ's return will be pre his millennial reign, and then he will reign for 1,000 years, and then after that the resurrection happens. And so there are two main views of premillennialism. There's historic premillennialism and there's dispensational premillennialism. Historic premillennialism was believed by many of the early church fathers like Papias and Irenaeus. And the view holds that Christ returns and defeats his enemies at some point in the future. Christ will return, he will defeat his enemies, and he will reign 1,000 years before the final judgment. Pretty basic, pretty standard. Now, dispensational premillennialism is something that I have other videos going into deeper detail about, but it believes that there is a secret rapture, and maybe not all dispensationalists believe these things, but this is pretty common. It's kind of hard to pin down specifically what dispensationalism is, because it's not really, but there is a very broad spectrum of beliefs within dispensationalism. So often when you say dispensationalists believe this, somebody will contradict you and say that they don't. But regardless, a very common belief within dispensationalism is that there is a secret rapture that happens before a 7-year tribulation period, a time of great suffering. So the rapture is where believers are taken away. This was probably popularized in modern times by the Left Behind books. So a secret rapture before a 7-year tribulation, followed by Christ's 1,000-year reign. Very popular in America, again popularized in modern times because of Left Behind. But also there was the person who actually created the doctrine of dispensationalism, and of course this is arguable, but let's say the person who popularized the term and who for the first time, formulated this as a complete doctrine. Let's say that. I think dispensationalists should be able to agree with that. His name is John Darby, and he was in the 19th century, so pretty recent. Dispensationalism kind of became a doctrine. And that influence spread throughout America, and then that actually inspired Left Behind. So Left Behind wasn't the beginning of dispensationalism, really John Darby was. And then after John Darby formulated the doctrine of dispensationalism, somebody who is a contemporary of his named C.I. Scofield, he took this view, and he also made something called the Scofield Study Bible, which was actually the first American study Bible, where in the Geneva Bible actually there was commentary by the reformers, but that was very uncommon until C.I. Scofield in America published the Scofield Study Bible, where he included notes and interpretations of certain things that pushed dispensationalism. And because that quote unquote helped people understand the Bible better, many people got the Scofield Study Bible, and that is why dispensational premillennialism was popularized in America. So basically, Christ's return is pre the millennial reign, pre the 1,000-year reign. Probably most Americans are premillennial. So let's go to amillennialism. Amillennialism is the view that the millennium is not necessarily a literal 1,000 years, but that it symbolizes the present reign of Christ from heaven with his saints. And so it's happening currently. The 1,000 years is a number of completeness. And also, to be fair, there are some premillennials who don't necessarily believe that the 1,000 years is a literal 1,000 years. And also, postmillennials, they also don't believe that the 1,000 years is literal. So I think that the main defining characteristic is not the metaphorical nature of the 1,000 years with amillennials, but it is the separation of physical versus spiritual. So Christ's reign is a purely spiritual thing right now, until in its fulfillment will become physical after this complete amount of time, as symbolized by the number 1,000 years. So this view, amillennialism, was famously held by Augustine of Hippo. He was a major early influence on this view. Many of the reformers, including John Calvin, held to amillennialism, and also the confessions like the Westminster Confession of Faith seem to assume the amillennial structure, except other views like postmillennialism and potentially even amillennialism could fit into these confessions as well. They're not total enemies. Nobody's a heretic no matter which of these eschatological positions you're in, unless we'll talk about the ones that are heretical regarding preterism. But you're not a heretic. No matter which of these broadly accepted views you are, people who disagree with you are not heretics. Even if you've never heard of these other views before, they are widely held throughout history, all of them to some extent. And they should be all, I think, taken seriously and discussed, and being open to hear the arguments about and look for the biblical evidence of these views, because that's what really matters. It doesn't matter who held these views in the past. Ultimately, it matters, what does the Bible say? So that is amillennialism. The key features of amillennialism is that Satan is bound now. So when Jesus returns, there's this binding of Satan, and that restricts his ability to deceive the nations, and also that there is no future earthly golden age. So premillennialism basically says that the world gets worse and worse and worse. Postmillennialism says that the world actually gets better. But amillennialism says that there's no, the world might get worse, it might get better, but there's no necessary promise of a future golden age like what postmillennials believe, and that history will culminate in Christ's return, the final judgment, and the new heavens and new earth. And there's also a heavy emphasis on something called the already and not yet of Christ's kingdom, where Christ's kingdom is here, and it's spiritual, and it's kind of physical, because Christ's kingdom exists through his body, and we're his body, but it's also not fully fulfilled, because eventually it will be fulfilled in a physical kind of way. So that's amillennialism. I actually grew up premillennial. I grew up being where my family and where I grew up was heavily influenced by the Left Behind books. And so I was actually a dispensational premillennial growing up. I don't believe that anymore. And then later, I went to seminary and picked up the amillennial view. I never, as I grew up, I didn't really like the Left Behind kind of eschatology. It just didn't feel right. It didn't fit. But I didn't know that there were other views until I discovered amillennialism, and it was very popular in seminary. And I think among academics, especially in America, at least from what I've seen, amillennialism is very popular, very prevalent in seminaries. And now I have found myself a postmillennial, and I've been a postmillennial for many years. And so I will explain what postmillennialism is now. Postmillennialism says that Christ's return will be after his millennial reign. And many postmillennials believe that his reign is right now. I believe that Christ's reign is right now. And the reason for that is because Jesus says all authority on heaven and earth has been given to me. So he has all authority. Therefore, go and baptize the nations. And so we also see when Jesus ascended, he is seated where? He's seated at the right hand of God the Father. So he is seated on the throne. He is ruling. So much like amillennials, postmillennials believe that Jesus is ruling now. I think that's kind of hard to escape, that Jesus is ruling now. I was having a conversation with somebody who was a premillennial, and he said, but I can't go see Jesus. Like, I can't touch him. He's not here physically, so he's not physically ruling. And I asked him, have you ever went to go see President Trump? Now, if you go to a rally or something, you would see him, but he said no. And I said, okay, so is Trump really physically ruling over you? And of course the answer is yes. So just because somebody is physically in a different place than you are, that doesn't mean that they're not physically reigning over you. You still have the physical responsibilities to Christ as you would if he were right next to you. So there's no difference between our actions of if he were physically reigning or not. So anyway, there are other biblical reasons too, but that is one of the, to me, the most obvious verses that supports postmillennialism. But this says that Christ will reign for 1,000 years. He will reign, and then is the return. And so a lot of the prophecies that point towards sin being destroyed, things getting better and better, the psalm that says, I will be seated at your right hand until your enemies are until my enemies are made my footstool. That describes the millennial reign where, according to postmillennials, Jesus Christ is reigning right now. And slowly, over a very long period of time, his enemies will be destroyed, and the final enemy is death until he finally returns. Which means, not necessarily over the past 10 years, but over the course of the past 6,000 years after the fall, the world is getting better and better, and not worse and worse. And one big piece of pushback against postmillennialism is, well, obviously America's getting worse. And to that I would say yes, except the newspaper headlines shouldn't control our eschatology. Just because things are getting worse this week, or, it's weird. It's like dispensationalism, for example, is really easy to believe, which says the world is getting worse and worse. It's really easy to believe when the headlines are bad. And it's easier to convince people that it's wrong when the headlines are good. And postmillennialism might be the opposite. It might be like where if things are getting worse, it seems like people have a better argument against postmillennialism because obviously things are getting worse. And then when things are really good, people might be tempted to say, look, postmillennialism is true because the headlines are good this week. But the truth is we shouldn't do that for anything. It seems like in a lot of cases that is the sole argument for a lot of people's dispensationalism, where it's like, oh, look, this cow was born, or look, this eclipse is happening. Jesus is going to return next week. And then he doesn't. And so then they're just like, well, it must be the next eclipse. That means that, if that is the kind of theology that we're participating in, all that means is we don't know what we're talking about because we just keep being wrong. So all that to say is, postmillennialism, back to the point, says that Christ will return after his millennial reign, which many postmillennials believe that is currently happening. Although you could say, I suppose, that the millennial reign is still about to happen at some point in the future, and then there is 1,000 years, and then Jesus returns after that. So you could maybe say something like that. And then there is a golden age where the gospel successfully permeates the world, leading to a period of extensive peace and righteousness before the culmination of the new heavens and new earth. The subtypes of postmillennialism is that, well, there is, it's not really a subtype, it's kind of an overlap, but there's something called optimistic amillennialism, which is very close in nature to postmillennialism. Basically, it's just amillennialism, but they say the world is getting better and better, and then Jesus is still spiritually reigning, and there's still this already and not yet, but then Jesus Christ is still going to return. So it's very close to postmillennialism. And then the other view of postmillennial is theonomic postmillennialism, which includes reconstructionist views that civil society should be progressively ordered according to God's law. It's a very popular view among postmillennialism, which basically says if the world is going to get better and better, God is going to use us as his body to make the world better and better. And so therefore, we should be actively striving to, through God, through the power of the Holy Spirit, spread the gospel and be active in society and be active in politics and intentionally try to make the world a better place around us, and then eventually it will be. And that's actually an interesting commonality. There are these weird connections between all the eschatological views, because here, I think, is where many postmillennials and premillennials actually overlap, because even though premillennials believe the world is getting worse and worse, it's hard to find, I think, a premillennial that, or at least especially a dispensational premillennial, who I actually disagree with theologically, but it's hard to find a dispensational premillennial, I think, who's educated in their theology, who doesn't believe that we should be active in society and active in politics and trying to make the world a better place. They just think we will fail, but postmillennials believe that we'll succeed. So there's actually some interesting overlap between different pairs of the three views, and that's kind of cool. It's kind of cool to see where there's more similarities between the views than we might initially think. They're not totally obnoxiously different from one another that we should be calling each other heretics, that kind of thing. Drop my mouse. So going on, the key features of postmillennialism says that the gospel succeeds, that the Great Commission succeeds, that the nations will actually successfully be baptized, that the world will successfully come to Christ, that the Great Commission to go and baptize the nations actually succeeds. It's not something that God just tells the people to do knowing that it fails, but that Jesus' commands were actually made for a purpose, and that it will eventually succeed. There's also a strong emphasis, usually in postmillennialism, on Christ's current reign through his people, and that his people will therefore transform society. Now, there's one potential ditch that I think postmillennials or people claiming to be postmillennials can fall into is, like amillennials might have a tendency to over-spiritualize the reign of Christ and forget the physical. It's possible, I think, it's more of a danger for some postmillennials, people calling themselves postmillennials, and we're seeing this a lot today in postmillennial circles, I believe, There's a ditch where people will kind of do the opposite of amillennials, this ditch that they could fall into, and over-physicalize Christ's reign and say that the spiritual doesn't matter, and to become something like Machiavellian, where they say something like, as long as we're accomplishing this end, then we can do whatever we want in the meantime. We can, be dictatorial rulers or whatever. And that's bad. That's not good. So there are definitely ditches within each of these eschatological views, but there's also a lot of unity between them as well. There's also with postmillennialism, it's hard to say, postmillennialism, a confidence that Christian influence will increase and not decrease over time. Now, again, that does not mean in recent history. It means over the course of time. So Christian influence seems to be decreasing in America, for sure, over the past many decades. But over time, we can trust that worldwide Christian influence will increase. And actually, that's what we've seen. I would much rather be living right now in America than first century Rome, where Christians were being beheaded and their heads were put on stakes lining the main roads. I don't see that ever happening. The most civilized nation in the world was beheading Christians and putting their heads on pikes. The only time that we see that today is with the least civilized nations in the whole world. So it seems like things are actually improving, and that's something that we can be hopeful for under postmillennialism. So there are also some other kind of views that I want to cover before we close, and that is preterism. I mentioned preterism a few times, and preterism, preter just means past. So preterism is basically the view of certain prophecies in the Bible happening in the past. And I think everybody, to some extent, is some kind of preterist, especially referring to the prophecies that are in Revelation. But the people who believe that all of the Revelation prophecies are in the future, they're called futurists. There's also the view that I said was heresy, that says that all of the prophecy in Revelation is past. Those are called full preterists, and that would be historically considered heresy because the final resurrection hasn't happened. Jesus' final return hasn't happened. The full culmination of the new heavens and new earth hasn't yet happened. And so to disregard that future hope of this perfect world that Jesus Christ is working to would be heresy. So most amillennials and postmillennials would be called partial preterist. I think the word preterist kind of has a bad rap, where people think, preterism is bad just because they're actually thinking of full preterism. But almost everybody is a partial preterist. So it shouldn't get the bad rap that it does. But futurism is the other option. There's partial preterism or futurism. Very few people are full preterists, and the people who are heretics. There's also a couple of views within the eschatological discussion called historicism versus idealism. Historicism says that prophecies unfold gradually throughout the entire course of history, matching major world events. For example, the Reformers interpreted the papacy as the Antichrist. And this is popular among Reformation-era Protestants, and it also ties prophetic symbols to historical figures and epochs. And so I agree with this. I think that probably most prophecies in the Bible actually refer to specific historical events. And so this is also what historic premillennials do. This is their position. But also the other view, aside from historicism, is called idealism. And idealism says that prophecies are not necessarily literal representation of physical events, but they are symbolic and perhaps even repetitive of ongoing good and evil. And so whenever there were prophecies calling for judgment, that prophecy could be fulfilled anytime there is judgment in a person's life, or anytime there is judgment in with a nation or with a war. Or so, like, in other words, prophecies can be repetitively fulfilled. those specific prophecies. Now, I don't think you have to necessarily pick either or of these positions in a hard way, because even though I believe that I hold to the historicist position, I also think that there is an element of truth to maybe there is an ultimate fulfillment to these prophecies that are actually a specific historic event, which I believe. But also there might be, because God promises a final judgment, that also implies that there could be lesser judgments before. And so the promise of a final judgment could imply that there are lesser prior fulfillments of that judgment pointing towards that final judgment, which is sort of the idealist position. Except I think like a full idealist would say that all the prophecies are basically metaphorical. They're all symbolic. But I definitely hold the historic position. But I also have known a lot of people who hold the idealist positions as well. And the idealist position, I think, is most common among amillennials. And that's where I've seen it too. So that was a lot. That was a lot of words. I know this was probably kind of a wordy and academic-y kind of episode, but hopefully you learned from it. And also, hopefully it helped you realize some other views that maybe you weren't aware of. And you can use this as kind of a springboard to learn about, to dive deeper into these things. There are books about all of the positions. A good book about postmillennialism there's one called Heaven Misplaced that I would heavily recommend. And also there's a book called, there's a few famous older books. I haven't read them, but I've heard good things about them. One is called Postmillennialism. Pretty simple. I forgot the name of the other one. But those are good books to check out if you want to dive more into postmillennialism, or you could just continue listening to my podcast, because this comes from a postmillennial, very optimistic perspective about the future. It's good being optimistic. It's good feeling that the world is going to be a better place and that Christ is going to win, not just spiritually, but physically on earth. And then you can also dive into the other views as well. I actually have a debate with somebody on my YouTube channel about dispensationalism. And I actually have discussed dispensationalism with a couple of different people, I think. So I've chatted about eschatology before. I have other videos kind of critiquing dispensationalism that you can check out. And if you enjoy this content and want to support the show, you can check out my Patreon link that is in the description of this the video or the podcast. And support the show. Share it with a friend if you want to. If you don't want to support the show with money, but you really, really want to do something helpful to try to spread the show to more people, help me out by sharing it. Share it to a place where it'll make people mad or somebody who would appreciate it. And I will catch you next time. Hope you enjoyed. God bless.